Hello, it's Wednesday, November 9th, and you're watching The Big Story with me, Chiao Suen. Subscribe to the Straits Times channel to stay up to date with our live news updates. Now, the Court of Appeal has passed judgment on the long-running Aljunied-Hougang Town Council trial. It found that the Workers' Party leaders, including its party chairman, current and former chiefs, and others involved in the running of AHTC, had acted in good faith when they decided to waive the tender for managing agent services shortly after the 2011 general election. This outcome is a partial reversal of the High Court's judgment in 2019. In a written judgment that allowed part of the appeals brought by the WP leaders and which was released today, a 5-judge panel said that the leaders do not owe fiduciary or equitable duties of skill and care to AHTC. However, they are found to be grossly negligent in the payments process, given that the town councillors were aware of conflicts of interest and thus the risk of overpayments or improper payments. The issue of damages for this negligence will be dealt with later. The case revolves around the handling of some $33 million in town council funds. Shortly after winning Aljunied GRC in 2011, the WP MPs did away with a tender and appointed as managing agent FMSS, led by Mr. Lowe's longtime colleagues. Payments to FMSS are thus improper, said an independent panel appointed by AHTC, which launched a suit for the money back. Lawyers for the WP MPs argued that they had to appoint FMSS so as to continue serving residents. Social media has become a permanent fixture in many of our lives, but it comes with its fair share of ills. With a new bill that has passed in Parliament today, users in Singapore can soon expect a safer social media landscape here. The Online Safety Amendment Bill will introduce new legislation to allow the IMDA to step in should egregious content surface on social media. Social media companies will have to establish systems or processes to prevent Singapore users, particularly children, from accessing content that presents a material risk of significant harm, including violent, sexual or suicide-related content. They may also be ordered to remove content. The time frame given will be stipulated on a case-by-case basis. Failure to comply with IMDA's direction could be an offence and is punishable by a fine of up to $1 million. The measures are expected to kick in as early as 2023. Minister for Communications and Information, Mrs. Josephine Teo, sat down with us to discuss the newly passed bill. Thank you so much for joining us today, Minister. Perhaps we can start at the very beginning. How did this bill even come about, and was there a catalyst that prompted the government to act?
Well, if you ask a Singaporean, how they feel about, walking on the streets at night, the findings are very clear. I think about 97% would say that they feel safe. But if you ask Singaporeans whether they are concerned about content that they come across online, actually a good 80% will say that they don't feel very comfortable. So there's a huge difference, a stark contrast. And if we ask ourselves why this might be the case, some kinds of content will come to mind. A few years ago, for example, there was a 14-year-old girl by the name of Molly Russell. She lived in the UK, and she had taken her own life. And when the investigations, took place, they uncovered thousands of images of self-harm that she had been looking at prior to her taking her own life. Every now and then, we also come across dangerous stunts, blackout challenges, for example, that are being promoted. They are served to us as users on social media. And I think during COVID, some of us will still remember something that was religiously very insensitive. There was a concern at one time that we were running out of toilet paper, and a particular image had appeared where they put the Bible in the Quran and says, this is what you can use. And that is something that is very offensive to the religious communities in Singapore. So when we look at all these content and we ask ourselves, in spite of the fact that we have actually taken some steps to regulate the online space, is it enough, and do we need to do more? I mean, some of us will still remember that Singapore was one of the first to introduce a personal data protection law. This happened all the way back in 2012, and then in 2020 we updated the law. In between, we've introduced POHA, the Protection Against Harassment Act, and we've also introduced POFMA, and this year FICA. I think we have to understand that in spite of these moves, from individuals' perspectives, from the perspective of communities, there are still issues concerning safety online, and we have to be willing to do more.
So earlier you mentioned, some of the concerning content that is permeating the internet, whether it's dangerous content or religiously insensitive content. I mean, we know that social media is such a fast-moving space, and it's always described as very difficult to regulate, right? So given how quickly some of these trends, products and services can emerge, and how quickly a obscure fad or a post containing hate speech, just how quickly those can go viral just like that. How do we ensure that the authorities are able to keep track of such a quickly evolving space, especially, maybe some of the murkier corners of the internet that perhaps as adults we're not quite as native to as perhaps our younger generation are? How do you think that will possibly work?
Well, very fortunately, amongst our public officials are also younger officers who themselves are digital natives, and they are keeping an eye out for what's happening in the far reaches of the internet, and also sharing with other colleagues areas that they think are concerning. But more importantly, I think the government has to be very open in engaging with a whole range of stakeholders. This could be groups of parents, this could be educators, this could even be non-governmental organizations that have an interest on this topic, interest in promoting mental wellness, for example. These are all the varied sources of information that the government can tap into to understand online developments better, and then to also put the question back to these stakeholders: what are some of the ways in which you think we can, regulate this space and make it feel safer for everyone? So it's going to be a multi-pronged approach. It's going to be a very dynamic approach. You are absolutely right in pointing out that the digital domain develops very, very quickly. And actually around the world, there are not so many playbooks. It's not as though when we were building up physical Singapore, you want to know how to keep the road safe. You want to know how to make sure that buildings don't topple over. Many other countries have already introduced, laws and regulation to ensure that physical safety can be, widely available. So you can study them and you can draw references. In the digital domain, there are far fewer playbooks, and there is a fair amount of experimentation on our own part on what will work.
So I suppose on the online space, there isn't really that sort of one-size-fit-all solution, right?
Not at all.
But well, if we go into the bill itself, I think what looms large for a lot of people will be that $1 million fine. But Singapore will be taking it as a penalty of last resort. And unlike, like you earlier mentioned, some countries like Australia and Germany, we don't have a 24-hour takedown timeline. Do you feel like we're being a little easy on these social media companies? And how effective do you think our measures will be, given what we have discussed about the dangers of the internet?
If and when the IMDA decides that there is a piece of egregious content that has to be taken down, I can assure you that it will be a matter of hours that we will give the social media platform to comply. Now, how do we look at this matter of the penalty? It will have to be taken in context. Firstly, it has to be proportionate to the kind of penalties that are imposed in other similar laws. But I think more importantly, what makes the social media platform successful? It is the fact that there are many users on them. And the amount of reputational damage that can be exacted, if a social media platform is found to have been, too unthinking in the way in which it carries out its systems and processes to protect the users. It has not acted, in a sufficiently robust manner to deal with content that is flagged to them, to be harmful. Then I think the other users will take note. And if the other users then decide that this is really not a platform that they want to engage with so much, actually I think that the damage to the social media platforms will be even greater. So I would look at it in that light.
Do you think that the laws are strict enough as is with the introduction of the new bill, or do you think there is room for us to become even perhaps stricter or tighter in the future?
The way I would look at it is that, if you want to have a tree grow tall, then you need to have strong roots. And one of those aspects of the strong roots are actually your laws and regulation. So in digital, if we want to see Singapore and Singaporeans take advantage of all the benefits that they bring, then we mustn't shy away from growing those roots. And we mustn't, be too slow in growing those roots as well. So the way in which I would look at it is that, the more we can strengthen the foundation, the better positioned we are to take full advantage of digital developments.
So you mentioned changes also in sort of the global platform, right? And Singapore isn't the first country to try to regulate social media, and some other countries around the world, their attempts have been slightly controversial. I think what comes to mind for me immediately is Germany and their Network Enforcement Act, which compels social media companies to take down hate speech or illegal content. So this bill of theirs has faced considerable criticism, both internally and from the wider international audience. How do we intend to face such potential criticisms should they arrive on our shores?
Was there a particular criticism that you came across that stood out for you?
I think some of the concerns people had were that, like you said earlier, they were blunt, and perhaps there were some concerns about censorship or how overly wide their policy was, and then that sort of created a space where people felt that it was taking down things that perhaps shouldn't or needn't have been.
Yeah. I think one of our takeaways when interacting with these social media companies is this. They tend to operate globally. And around the world, people have different expectations, and norms are also not identical. So yes, they can respond to our requirements to put in place standards, for content moderation. But even with the best efforts, it's very likely that they will fall short, simply because the nuances in each society is different. The example that I shared with you earlier on this idea that you could, use the Quran or the Bible as toilet paper, the degree of, offense that it causes to our communities, that point is sometimes lost on a social media service. In some other context, this could be considered as, well, just a joke, funny. But in our context, it's not just a joke, it's not funny, it's deeply offensive. And that is where I think we have to complement the systems and processes that we require the social media services to put in place, with also the ability to act. Because we come across content that we know in our context needs to be taken down. So I think the two have to work hand in hand.
You'll find a longer version of my interview with Minister Josephine Teo on the Straits Times YouTube channel, where we discuss offline interventions and ways to help parents keep their children safe online. In other news, COE prices are on the up, with multiple categories hitting all-time highs. The open category climbing to over $116,000, about $2,000 more than the previous record. The COE for larger vehicles also hitting an all-time high at over $115,000, breaking the previous record by 4.9%. Premiums for motorcycles have also increased for the 12th straight bidding exercise, closing above $13,000 for a new record. Most GST-registered businesses have started preparing for the GST hike to 8%, which kicks in on January 1st. According to IRAS, about 40,000 will be dealing with a rate change for the first time. This is the first of two planned GST hikes, with the second increase to 9% taking place in January 2024. Results of the US midterm elections are trickling in, with the Republicans on track to take control of the House, as widely predicted. But over in the Senate, where 35 of 100 seats are up for grabs, several key races are too early to call. Based on exit polls, voters listed the economy and inflation as their most important concerns. Now let's take a look at another major election this one happening closer to our shores. Caretaker Health Minister KHAIRY Jamaluddin has declared his ambition to be Malaysia's future Prime Minister, urging voters in the opposition stronghold of Sungai Buloh to support him at the upcoming general election. He is facing 6 other contenders in the November 19th election. Mr. KHAIRY stressed, however, that in this election, incumbent Prime Minister Ismail Sabri Yaakob will be the Prime Minister if BN wins the national polls. And before we go, one lucky person just got a whole lot richer, holding the only winning ticket for the record $2 billion Powerball jackpot. The winning ticket ends a string of 40 drawings that produced no winners, which puts the jackpot into record territory. But the ticket holder is not the only one with a heavier wallet, as the owner of Joe's Service Centre was also presented with a cheque for $1 million for selling the winning ticket. And those are our top stories. Visit straitstimes.com for more news and our YouTube channel for more videos. Subscribe by hitting the red button below. I'm Chao Suen, and I'll see you tomorrow on The Big Story.